it's an undoing of history, bringing us back to the garden.
Hey, this is Unrefined Podcast. Welcome to another episode. Hey, you guys. This is Brandon with another episode and with co-host Lindsay.
Hey, guys.
And an awesome guest who needs no introduction, but I will introduce him. It's the Pastor Doug Van Dorn.
That's great to be with you guys.
We're going to dive into some interesting topics, I think. I think it's probably a topic that Doug doesn't talk a lot about on podcasts. I don't know if he'll have to tell me if he does or not. But I wanted to start off with just basically talking about what's going on in the world. And I read your posts a lot, Doug. Well, actually, just about all of them. And, you know, you have such a pulse on what's really going on and stuff. You know, what do you think is going on with just the economy and politics and all that kind of stuff? And the big question I'd like to ask you is, what do you think about the whole Trump-Ron DeSantis thing? What do you think's going to kind of pull down there?
Yeah, I mean, well, for 3 years anyway, I think the world has been able to see some things that we have not been allowed to see before. And I think that I would chalk that up to some divine providence and also some very deliberate maneuvers on the part of what I think is the good side of a war that we're fighting. So I actually believe that we are in a war. Sometimes I joke with people that we're actually still in World War I and we're kind of seeing it come to its culmination.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. You've talked about what was it? Fifth generation?
Fifth generation warfare. Yep.
Yeah. Can you unpack that? I've been wanting to ask you what that is. I mean, can you kind of describe that for us?
Can say briefly that you have different generations of warfare. Kind of your classic warfare started ages and ages ago, just kind of going on battlefields and stuff. And over the course of time, as technology increases, you move to aerial warfare, tank warfare, all this kind of stuff. And guerrilla warfare was an introduction. I don't remember which generation that was. But the fifth generation warfare is a warfare really using words and ideas and thought and trying to control the mind of the other side. So you're not necessarily attacking them with conventional warfare, at least not at the beginning. You're trying to take over a civilization through ideas, philosophies, changing their language, kind of classic communism sort of stuff. But
so information warfare, basically.
Information warfare. So yeah,
InfoWars.
InfoWars. Yeah, when he says that, he actually kind of had the pulse.
He was right.
He did. He's been right on a lot of things. I mean, he really was.
Yep.
He's a bit crazy, but I guess you have to be to kind of do what he does. So.
a bit crazy, but yeah, I agree. Yeah, he's been right on a lot of things. The reason I wanted to bring all this up is because this leads into our topic today, and I wanted to ask you and I'm going to caveat that it is speculation. Do you speculate, Doug, that we live in a time that's different than any other time that's been around? Can you see, even in your lifetime, and we're close to the same age, I know I can see such a dramatic difference in the past 3 years, like you said. And do you believe that we're entering into an unprecedented time?
It's such a hard question for me to answer.
I know.
Because, well, I mean, we're going to talk about eschatology, right? So,
right.
So many people, when they answer that question, they just kind of go right to Revelation or something, and that's not what I do. That doesn't mean that I don't think that we might not be entering into something apocalyptic, but I don't know that I tie that necessarily to any particular scripture or whatever. Certainly not my eschatology directly, maybe indirectly.
Right.
So that, I mean, this is
Right.
kind of, I'm sounding kind of fuzzy because it's a hard question for me to answer. I mean, on one hand, there's no question that we're living in unprecedented times in all of world history. I mean, you've never
Yeah.
had the ability to destroy every human being on the planet until, obviously before our lifetimes, but not much before it.
Yeah.
The whole artificial intelligence thing, transhumanism thing, that's never, people might have had ideas of wanting to do that, but the way that we're able to do it today is completely unprecedented in all of world history. Being able to take down people with viruses and to genetically manipulate food and human DNA, the way that we do it, it's completely unprecedented. So, yes, we are totally living in unprecedented times. We're living in, like I said, if we're living kind of near the end or climax of World War I or something, it's been a long time coming. I don't know if people want me to go the direction of, well, what do you think about, Jesus coming back and all this kind of stuff? That's where I just don't know. I mean, I teach so much on the first coming, and one of the things that's striking to me about Jesus' first coming is that nobody, like they were expecting Messiah. So when Messiah came, many people were able to say, yeah, this is the Messiah, but he didn't come the way they thought he was going to come. And he completely disappointed their expectations because he had a plan that was hidden in plain sight in the Old Testament, but also cloaked from their view. So that kind of, to me, is a warning that maybe when he returns again, things might be a little bit different than what probably all of us think. And it's just, I just think it's so interesting to look at the times we're living in just on that basis alone without even having to speculate whether or not this is like the very end. It's just, Confucius, I think, said, may you live in interesting times. And that's totally what we live in. And it's fascinating to me.
Yeah, I used to get, because I was raised, I think most people in America, for some reason, were raised pre-trib, pre-millennialist, and I got real disenchanted with it. And the biggest thing that disenchanted it with me is I would look at foreign mission fields and I would see the incredible tribulation that China and parts of Asia and Russia and North Korea and these different countries are going through. And how can we as Americans say, oh, yeah, well, so America goes, so goes the tribulation when they're going through it, you know? And that's when I began to really kind of look at the book of Revelation, but not just with Revelation, but with Daniel and the prophetic Old Testament scriptures as well. And I was a partial preterist for a while, and I'm still not completely convinced that there's not some things that absolutely have been true. It's kind of a Duke's mixture of me being I'm a realized futurist. I don't know if that's even,
That's an interesting way of putting it. Yeah,
that's more or less where I am too.
Yeah. I mean, and I think we call it orange and orange and an apple, and I think sometimes we can conflate things Jesus said into being all one thing, and he's not talking that way at all. Hey, my unrefined friends, I just want to tell you guys that I am so thankful that you are my life. Some of our best fans have been writing to us, and I just so encouraged about how lives are being transformed and people are getting something out of this podcast. I mean, that's what it's all about. That's why we're doing this, is to glorify Jesus and to just look at the world and have a more open view of the seen and the unseen and the supernatural in the world. So while we're doing that, we're going to handle all different kinds of topics. But see, what I'd like for you to be involved in or part of is our members only group. Things that are coming in our members only group that are going to just blow your mind. Not to mention, there's going to be episodes in there that you won't be able to hear just on the normal episode channel. So make sure to visit our website at unrefinedpodcast.com and check out our members only community. I just can't stress the fact that, we're after building a community, and there's so much out there, you guys, and there's so much coming. I really believe we need to build these strong communities of Christ followers to be able to handle what might be coming in the future days. We're sure that you'd be a good fit, and we cannot wait. I can't wait to see you there. This show today, everybody, is about eschatology, one of those fun things that everybody loves to argue about. But we're not going to argue today because Doug is awesome and I really respect him. And I want to learn from him today because I think his take on the end times is a little different and it has possibly some speculation about the giants and the Nephilim and their part in it, too. And so that's what we kind of want to. So I'm going to turn it over to Doug now and let him set us up and just talk about his journey through eschatology.
Mhm. Well, I think like you guys, sounds like both of you. I grew up in a dispensational, at least family, and probably most of the people in the churches I grew up in. So
Yeah.
we always argued about pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, and so I never even heard that there was anything else at all out there. And I went to college in 1988. That was my freshman year up at a Christian college in St. Paul. And there was this dude who had come out with this book called 88 Reasons Why Jesus Will Return in 1988.
I remember
And
that book.
I mean, we were it was like our first month at school, and the entire school was just on edge, completely freaking about how Jesus was going to come back in the rapture, that weekend. And then of course it didn't happen. And the few who didn't buy into all that were told you so sort of things. Funny thing is, that guy came out with another book the next year. He said he missed one reason. So he came out with 89 reasons in 89. And that one didn't sell as many copies as the first one did.
Thank God.
Yeah, exactly. But, so these predictions, I think there was a big one in 1994, 1996, obviously Y2K. 2007 had another big one. 2012 had a big one. We've had
Aztec.
all these.
Yeah, wasn't the Aztec one 2012? The
Yeah,
Aztec
absolutely. I
calendar.
mean, that's why they made that movie, where they were capitalizing on on the end of the world apocalyptic stuff that people were talking about. So at some point, I just grew tired of it. In fact, I remember when it was. I was a youth pastor about 1994. I think it was that particular one, and all the kids wanted me to teach on Revelation because Jesus is coming back, and I had already seen these things fail a few times, and I'm like, all right, I'll do it. And so I taught them from this old 100-year-old book by a guy named Clarence Larkin called Dispensational Truth. And he had this little section at the end called like the dispensational truth of the Great Pyramid, and how the pyramid has like all the exact timelines lining up to the end of the world starting in essentially 1994. That's when the rapture would have to happen. And it was all focused on.
Is that the one with all the cool
all the
artwork and
charts,
stuff in it?
baby. All the charts. Oh yeah. So much fun. I mean, I had a great time with it. And I had gone through it before, and I've learned a lot from that guy. I actually consider him one of my early mentors in terms of book reading and stuff.
Yeah.
I think he was a Christian, but I think he's totally wrong on his reading of the scripture and on his take on the rapture, millennium, and all this kind of stuff. But I told the kids, I said, look, I'm going to teach this, and if it doesn't come true this year, I'm done with it, because I think this is as good a year as any that it could happen. And if it doesn't happen, then it just means that I have no idea what I'm talking about. So it didn't happen. And I really put away eschatology for a long time. And I'm a reformed guy. And at that point in time, I was kind of becoming more that way. And so I just kind of put the eschatology aside, started thinking about the soteriology and how we're saved and those kinds of questions.
Yeah.
And the people that I started listening to, actually indirectly were teaching eschatology, and I had no idea that they were doing it, which was really interesting to think about. Because usually it's kind of in your face. I mean, you just talk about the rapture, all the crazy things that are going to happen, and you just go through the different chapters of Revelation and what trumpet's going to go off at this point, that kind of stuff. But this was indirect, and I did not understand what they were doing to my brain. And at some point in time, having just listened to them over a long period of time, I just kind of found myself in a totally different eschatological camp once I realized that there even was such a thing. I'm like, oh, I guess that's what I am now. So the way that they taught this was by talking about um, what is often the way that it's presented in the New Testament between two ages. Okay, so you'll have these dichotomies of this age and the age to come, the present age, the age to come, the this present evil age and the age to come. So two ages. Very simple way of doing it. It's not all the time that it talks about that. I think we can get into this later, where I think Paul in maybe Ephesians talks about many different ages in the ages gone past and in the ages to come. So it's not like the Bible only sees two ages, but for the sake of eschatology, that's
Right.
exactly what it does.
That sounds
And
like George Ladd.
it
He,
does in some ways, yeah. And so George
yeah,
Ladd is a historic premillennialist, um, but that's still in the premillennial camp. And what I didn't understand is that these guys were teaching me a different view of the millennium than what premillennialism was,
right.
which is called, and I hate the word because it was really given by its opponents as kind of a curse word, and it's not even a true in what it says, but it's the amillennial view of Scripture.
Mm,
So there's really three millennial views. There's premillennialism, postmillennialism, and amillennialism. And essentially, what you're talking about there is Jesus going to return before a millennium or after a millennium? And actually, when you just put it in that way, there's only two views. There's pre and post, because the post mill and the mill both believe Jesus will return after the millennium.
yeah.
But they separate because for some kind of interesting reasons. I think that the premillennial view that I grew up in, very America or British centered, and
Yep.
like you guys said, they don't seem to care about what's going on in famines in Ethiopia or persecutions in China or whatever. It's just kind of what's
Yeah.
happening with me, and it's very
Yeah.
much newspaper eschatology oriented. So you pick up the paper. Oh my goodness, I just saw that the prime minister of Israel was assassinated. Jesus has to be coming back. That kind of stuff. And
Yeah.
premillennialism always seems to flourish when things are going bad in a culture. So during World War One, World War Two, the Cold War, premillennialism went crazy. During the Gilded Age, during the Roaring Twenties, um, you know, those kinds of things, postmillennialism seems to do better because, in some ways, I think probably be some guys out there that might disagree with me, but I think postmillennialism is kind of doing the same thing premill does, except it's more on the optimistic thing. It says, see, look, things are getting better, and so we must be kind of moving into the millennium. So for those guys, it's not like this sharp break between you're not in the millennium and then you are, with like a 7-year tribulation in between. For them,
Right.
it's kind of like it's like the question of when is a person bald? Like how many hairs do you have to lose before that you're bald? you know, I don't. Is it all of them? Is it most of them? Just the top of the head. That's kind of what post
Yeah.
millennialism is. Like when are you in the millennium? Um, and you just kind of find yourself. You just kind of find yourself that you're in it. So
Well, I asked a guy the other day, a full preterist, which I don't think is orthodox. Anyway, that's just my opinion.
I agree with you on
But
that.
I was asking him. He was talking about all the things that the world getting better. And I asked him, I said, now if we're going to look at this from a Christian viewpoint, an eschatological viewpoint, wouldn't the church be the instrument that's making the world better? But it looks like to me it's the world that's making the world better
Yeah.
with technology and stuff. And how can you even use that as an indication of, see, the world's getting better? Yeah, all the
Yeah.
elites are making things better. They're going to give us transhumanism. They're going to give us eternal life. We're going to give us implants. I mean, yeah, the world is getting better, but is the church the there's a Latin word for it. Is it the modus operandi, I guess, of what's creating the world being better? I mean, do you understand what I'm saying, Doug?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, the question of better is, are you talking materialistically? Are you talking technologically? Are you
Yeah,
talking
spiritually.
New
Yeah.
World Order? Are you talking Gnosticism? I mean, what's your categories for what makes it
We're
better?
eating better than ever, but our
Yeah,
kids don't know what gender they are.
exactly.
Exactly. Yep.
So, I guess go back to the two age thing. What
Yeah.
they were talking about was, if you can imagine a line, a line of history that really goes from Adam to the time of Christ when he was here first coming, and imagine that this is the ground and we're standing on the ground. Then you have another line that's above you, and it kind of represents heaven, and that line starts. Um, when Jesus is here at his first coming, and then it goes on all the way into eternity future. So you have two horizontal lines. One represents the old age on the bottom, and or the this present age. Let me put it that way, not the old age, but this present age or this present evil age, or we could talk
Hmm.
about it as the flesh. And then on the top, you have the age to come. And so what's interesting then is that you have the age to come and the present evil age overlapping. They're both there when Jesus is there. In fact, there's two vertical lines that you can now put. The first vertical line is Jesus' first coming, and the second vertical line is his second coming. Okay, so what you have then is kind of a square overlap between this present age and the age to come, so that our feet are in this present age, but our head, which is Christ. So what it uses is the metaphor of the head and the body of the church. Jesus is the head of the
Yeah.
church, and the church is his body. So his
Right.
body is on the earth. That's the church, and we're standing in the present evil age. But the head is in the heavenly realms. He's ascended into glory and power, and he is now squarely in the age to come. And because the head and the body are attached together, we're in both at the same time. So actually, a historic pre-mill like George Ladd can actually have kind of a same view, where they would disagree is really on the question of the millennium, but not necessarily on the two ages. So I think that's good, because it shows that between the millennial views, you can actually have quite a bit of common ground when you're talking about what we're looking at here. But for me,
Yeah.
the guys that were talking about this were actually all amillennial. And so amillennial is a word that, like I said, was given kind of by the opponents of the view who didn't like it. And the letter A is just a negation, without, and the millennial is the millennium, so it's without the millennium. So like an atheist is without God, somebody who does not believe in God. So literally, the word means that an amillennialist does not believe in the millennium, but nothing could be further from the truth. An
Mm.
amillennialist rather believes that we are in the millennium right now. And that's where they would disagree from probably most post millers. I don't think most post mill guys think that we're in the millennium right now. Although maybe some of them have changed their mind. I don't know. And certainly no premillennialist believes we're in the millennium right now. So that's what distinguishes the mill view from the post mill view.
Yeah. Can Doug? Could you? I've never understood in the premillennial viewpoint what is the purpose of the millennium? Is it almost seems like it's just like it's there in the Bible, so we have to say it's like real and it's there, but we really don't know what it's for. I mean, I know that's not your expertise, but can you kind of explain what is the purpose of the millennium in the premillennial stance?
Well, I think it's Jesus coming back in his glory as king to rule physically on the earth,
Right.
before the eternal state is brought about.
Okay.
In my mind, as an Amil guy, I actually take the passages that they read for being millennial passages, like the
Right.
lion and the lamb will lie down together, that kind of thing in Isaiah. I take that to be talking about the eternal state, not the millennium.
Hmm.
Okay, so what I think in that same passage in Isaiah, it talks about how the child will live to be 100 years or 1,000 years or whatever. And the whole idea is that death is kind of taken away. Well, I think that's metaphorical language for the eternal state, but they take it kind of more literally and say, well, no, there's still going to be death, but at the end of the millennium. And so it's kind of like, because they read it in that more literalistic way, let me put it that way.
Yeah,
Because I think reading something spiritually is actually reading it literally, because I believe the spiritual world is literal. It's just not physical. So what they're doing is they're reading it physically. And so because there's, for instance, death there, there has to be an end to that millennium, and then they kind of have a bad time again, and then Jesus comes back and ushers in the eternal state. So I think for them, it's just really Jesus is he's ruling as king in a reconstituted nation of Israel over the Jews. That's another kind of important part of that, because especially with dispensationalism, God kind of set aside the Jewish people for a while so that he could save Gentiles, but he's going to go back to dealing with the Jewish people at some point in time as a biological group of people, where he's going to save them all, and then everybody's going to live happily for 1,000 years. So,
yeah, those passages you talked about where I know there's a couple in Isaiah where seems like it's the age to come, but people are still dying. I'll be honest; those always confused me too.
Sure. Yeah. Well, there's
and it's easy to say, well, that's got to be this millennial view, but maybe that's just as close as the Hebrew mind could get to, thinking about eternity around that time. I don't know. That's something I've always thought about.
Yeah, I think that when we have a very specific kind of modernistic, materialistic way of reading everything that we read, we interpret our entire world through a scientific worldview. So we kind of import that back into the scripture, when that might not be at all what they're talking about. So if you have death in a passage like that, and you were to ask Isaiah, what are you talking about? Are people going to literally die? He'd be like, what are you talking about? I'm trying to talk about how good things are going to be. And putting death in it just kind of gives you a even greater backdrop of how good things are going to be. So,
yeah, I feel that way about the historical grammatical way of looking at the Bible. I believe in it. I agree with it. I think it's the primary foundation for how we should read the Bible. But at the same time, it's a very modernistic way of reading the Bible that the first century or the Second Temple period wouldn't have known about. They read the Bible differently than that. That's more of an Enlightenment way of reading the Bible, even though I don't want to discredit it because I use it. Does that make sense?
Sure. I mean, to one degree or another, I think we all read the Bible. I think we read every book. And I think everybody has always read every book to some degree from an historical grammatical point of view. You want to know what the grammar says. You want to know what it meant in its context.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But yeah, I completely agree that this is not the category that they had in mind, especially in more of their metaphysics. So maybe it's not a hermeneutics question; it's more a metaphysics question. What do they mean by spirit and matter, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, good point. Yeah, I just don't understand how sometimes the book of Revelation, which is obviously loaded with symbolism, is like a book that people try to read so literal. And I mean that in a, not a literal, I guess not literal, in a literalistic sense, and it's just so obvious that you can't possibly read that without knowing the context of what it was written in, and the just the symbols and all the different stuff that they used. And I mean, I think about who is the famous guy that wrote a lot of Hal Lindsey, and how he took these monsters and made them helicopters. And
which is funny, right? Because he prides himself on the literal view. So how come his literal view isn't that these are like
exactly
scorpion lion
they just
men
monsters
that are coming out of hell? Why do they have to be a helicopter? It's so weird.
Well, and I've done enough, ancient Near East diving to see that there's mythological monsters with scorpions. I mean, I'm studying right now, and I wanted to share this with you, Doug. The fish app in Lake Van up there, and the I read your sermon on Leviathan, And I thought about it. It's those bishops that are all in Armenia, that they're everywhere sticking up, and it's a bull and a fish, and it's like hearkening back to Leviathan, connected to that Lake Van. And I thought about your sermon about feeding on Leviathan, feeding on Jesus, and
Yeah.
and that. But at the it just it amazes me that we believe in these creatures. I mean, if we can believe that Jesus is both 100% God and man, and he was born of a virgin, why can't we believe that these things in Revelation are literally monsters or something like that? Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm all over the place, but
Sure. I don't know. Like, this is a tough question to me because, you read, especially the more liberal guys, and when they talk about Leviathan, they will entirely spiritualize it. And so you see
right,
this even in study Bibles when what is the Leviathan? Does it represent? It just purely represents chaos. That's all it is. It was just a metaphor.
yeah,
And then
yeah,
on the other side of it, you have guys trying to say, well, it was an elephant, or it was a crocodile, or those kinds of things. And I have zero problem if Leviathan and Behemoth were actually either either were like a dinosaur and a dragon, or if they were modeled on those. Either way,
yeah.
it doesn't matter to me. I don't know that if you were to go to Peter and say, "Hey, Peter, do you think that there's a giant plesiosaur that's living underneath the Sea of Galilee?" That he'd be like, "Oh yeah, totally." But if you were to say, "Hey, Peter, do you think Leviathan lives in the Sea of Galilee?" I think he could say, "Yeah," because the sea is chaos. It represents
Mm,
chaos. It's the embodiment of
yeah,
Hmm.
chaos. And again, see what
yeah,
we're doing there, even in our questions that we bring to this. It's sort of like we have this modernistic
yeah,
impulse to say, "Well, it has to be physical."
yeah.
Maybe. I don't, like I said, I don't have a problem if it is. And I actually kind of think it probably, in some way, either is modeled on it or was one of those. But I don't know that that's a question that they were even asking.
Right. Yeah, that's it. We're not asking the same questions because we're so far removed from their culture. And I don't know if we'll ever get back to asking the same questions. Maybe we will in the days of Noah. I don't know. But all I got to say is, if Nephilim come back in their giant form, we'll be asking some questions then. So anyway, sorry, Doug. I don't mean to keep taking you off target, chasing rabbits.
Oh, there's all great things. There's a million ways to go with this, guys. So it's
Yeah,
such a deep and interesting topic, I think,
I
that
think so too.
just 1,000 ways you can go with it. So any of these questions and bunny trails I think are perfectly legitimate. Um, I was going to say one thing is that I think one of the reasons why people will read Revelation and the images and numbers and everything in it so literally or physically is because, and I think this is especially true with old school dispensationalism, people just don't know their Old Testament.
Mm.
And they don't know,
Mm,
and they also don't know how to read. They don't know how to read books. They don't read books. That's a
mm,
huge problem. They especially
mhm.
don't read apocalyptic literature, so they've never immersed themselves in books like Enoch or Baruch or the Sibylline Oracles or anything like that to see how images are used, let alone Gilgamesh epic or Baal cycle or any of that kind of stuff. So they don't know how the images have been used traditionally. They're not familiar with them. A lot of times people don't even know that they're coming from the Old Testament. And so they just have this one book in front of them, the book of Revelation, and they just start reading it. And not only do they
Mm,
not have the background that they really ha- need, that I think that virtually everyone in the as the original audience would have automatically had, they also read the book the way that they read um, a novel or a history book. So they read it chronologically,
yeah,
and they
yeah,
just assume that this book is chronological, and that's actually where I think the biggest divergence from the millennial views occurs, because people are saying, well, chapter 2 happens after chapter 1. Chapter 3 happens after chapter 2. All the way up to chapter 20 happens after chapter 19 because they've read the book chronologically. And if you read the book chronologically and that's the way John meant it to be read, then I can see why you would come to that conclusion. But the question really needs to be, how are we supposed to read the book? How is it presenting itself to us? We shouldn't come to Revelation with an assumption and never challenge the assumption. We need to do some investigation first into the book to figure out if it tells us how it wants to be read, and then we can read it the way that it wants us to read it.
Well, too, Doug, correct me if I'm wrong here. Knowing John, we've read the book of John. We've read 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. Knowing how he writes, knowing how his gospel is presented, which, in my opinion, is not entirely chronological. It was put together very specifically for very specific purpose. It's very clear. Why would we not take that into account as we read the book of Revelation? Does that make sense?
Makes more sense than you have any idea of, Brandon. So let me. this is kind of where I wanted to go next with this, was to John.
Boom!
But I need to.
Good job.
I need to do a little bridge work before we do that.
All right.
Okay, so the first thing I want to give you just different literary ways of thinking about this book and how it presents itself to us. So the first thing that we need to talk about is something called a chiasm. And this is becoming more popular. More people are learning about what chiasms are, but still a lot of people have never even heard of the idea.
Yeah, I studied in IBS. Inductive Bible study, baby.
Exactly. They're actually, I'm more and more convinced that pretty much this was the way that the ancient mind thought. So we think linearly. We think beginning to end. Okay, you have a line and it's just start, end. And that's the way we outline books. So think about it, go to any outline in a study Bible and it'll say point 1, point 2, point 3, point 4, then you're done. That's how the book is ordered. Linear, right? But I think that the ancient mind thought, I don't know that it's right to call it a circle, but it kind of is, because it comes back in on itself. And they do this in little sections like paragraphs. They do it in entire books. They even do it in verses. So when Jesus says, the first will be last and the last will be first, that's a chiasm, very simple one, in one verse. You have first, last, last verse. If you put letters to it, you have A, B, B, A. A stands for first, B stands for last. And what it's done is it's closed in on itself. So it begins and ends at the same place, and then it has a middle. So if you have an A, B, C, B, A, then you have a single verse that's a middle. You can have an A, B, C, C, B, A. You can go all the way out as far as you want. You go A, B, C, D, F, G, H, I, J. And then all the way back in if you want to. And when you do that, then you're deliberately paralleling things on either side so that those letters match up. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
I wrote down la-di-da, da-di-la here. I don't know what that meant. That's just my weirdo way
of... like it. There's your chiasm. So Revelation, the book of Revelation, is a chiasm. And this is very important for people to understand. And it's chiastic on some pretty amazing levels. So the very center of the book is in chapter 12, where Satan is cast out of heaven by Michael the archangel. Very center of the book. On either side of that, you have the woman fleeing into the wilderness. On either side of that, you have the dragon. On either side of that, you have a woman again. On either side of that, you have two witnesses and two beasts. On either side of that, you have 144,000. On either side of that, you have 7 seals and 7 bowls. On either side of that, you have 7 epistles to 7 angels and 7 angels. And then you have a prologue and epilogue. All of that's pointing to a center. And the center is where Satan is cast out of heaven. Now, believe it or not, One scholar is a guy named Warren Gage, who professor out at Knox Theological Seminary for a while, I think in Florida. He takes this chiasm, goes all the way from A to Z, and you're only halfway through the book. So then it goes A, B, B, C, C, all the way to Y, Y. So in other words, it has almost 2 full alphabets worth of chiasms that go to the center of the book. Now that's insane and totally deliberate and gives you very important theology that Christ is conquering the devil. But it also says, maybe if things are repeating, that maybe I'm not supposed to read this as linearly as I thought I was. Okay. Second one comes off of that. And this is a little bit different way of thinking about the book of Revelation, which is in terms of cycles. So there's 7 cycles in this book, according to the way a lot of people read it. And that's an important number because 7 is a massive number in Revelation, and 7 is the perfect number.
Right.
So that's what it represents. 7 days of the week, right? That kind of thing. So when the week is over, you start a new week again because you've completed the whole thing. So 7 cycles would bring you to a completion. And the way I view these 7 cycles is imagine one of these circular staircases that go up, like maybe in a rampart of a castle or something. And let's say that you're on like facing north, and every time you get due north, there's another window that looks out. And so when you start at the bottom, you're looking out due north and you're standing on the ground. But then when you go around a full circle of these stairs, now you're up higher and you have a better, higher view, but you're still standing in the exact same vertical axis that you were before. And you can do that all the way up to 7 times, so that when you get to the very top, you've got a great view, of the whole landscape out around you, but you're still standing in the same vertical axis. So essentially, the cycles are chapters 1 through 3. So that takes you through the beginning and then through the churches. Okay, the 7 churches, letter to 7 churches. And then cycle 2 is chapters 4 through 7, and that ends in a judgment day. And by the way, the letters to the churches call you to persevere through to the judgment day. Cycle 3 is 7 trumpets, chapters 8 through 11. It ends in a judgment day. Cycle 4, chapters 12 through 14, persecution of the dragon in the church, ends in a judgment day. Cycle 5 is the vision of the 7 bowls, ends in a judgment day. Cycle 6, fall of Babylon and the church's vindication, ends in a judgment day. Cycle 7, chapters 20 to 22, is ending in a judgment day, but at the very last chapter, you have this vindication of the righteous. And so it takes you kind of to the top of the castle, if you want to look at it that way, and gives you this great view that actually is a chiasm with Genesis 1. So the whole Bible ends up being chiastic because you begin and end in the Garden of Eden, and then you have everything in the middle.
Oh, wow.
Those judgment days, and several of those, are actually using almost the exact same language of like the grapes of wrath and treading on the wine. And when you read it, it sounds like it's talking about the same thing, especially when you put them side by side. So the reason this matters is because if you're reading the book chronologically, so let's go to like a dispensational reading of the book. What they'll do is they'll say, yeah, chapters 1 through 3 they definitely seem different. So the way I heard it was Jesus is writing those first 3 chapters to the church, but then the rapture happens. And then the rest of the book is talking about the Jews, and it's all chronological. And so all the rest of it is just Jew chapter after Jew chapter. Then you get to the judgment day in chapter 19. And then you have this happy thing going on at the beginning of chapter 20, where the Satan is bound for a millennium. And then you have another judgment going on at the end of chapter 20. So that must be a totally different war. And so all these other judgment days that I said end cycles, they read those as kind of different battles. And at the end, we kind of end at the same place, but how you get there is really, really different. And that's because of how we're reading the book. And the question again is, how does the book want us to read itself? And that's the question that we can't impose upon it. We have to ask it how it wants to be read. And so what I'm suggesting is that the book actually gives us internal clues that says, I don't want you to read me linearly. I want you to read me cyclically, or at least chiastically, something like that. And when you do that, you automatically have to start coming to some pretty different conclusions than what you would if you're reading it completely linearly. So I'll stop there, see if you guys have any questions or thoughts about it.
Yeah, I have a comment. This is really interesting, and I'm going to bring in one of my passions to this is the guitar. I watched a video of a guy kind of explaining Eddie Van Halen and how he did stuff. He had something they called the Franken scale, and without getting too technically for our audience, technically music theory, he would, like in the key of A, he would take the notes in the key of A, and he would start the root note would be A, and he would go all up and down the fretboard as long as he ended at another root note that was part of that scale. And so it was almost like it was chaotic in between. He could put sharps and flats and chromatics and all kinds of weird stuff. But as long as he started with a root note in the scale and ended in the root note in the scale, it all kind of it was just Eddie's signature sound. And I'm saying all that because that kind of reminds me of what we're talking about here, except it's a little more ordered. But I think through history, it instead of going in just very neat cycles, like I would say, like what Marx or some of those guys would probably, go after. It's sort of it's a chaotic cycle just because of the nature of the world and all that sort of stuff. But it ends, like you said, from perfection, the root note, and it starts from the root note in Genesis and ends in the root note in that last cycle in Revelation. And that was just, I think, in music, Doug. I mean, it's just my thing. And now that I'm learning to play the guitar, I totally see it everywhere. So,
well, it's a perfect analogy. In fact, it's very perfect because how many notes are there? There's these 7 notes, and then you have the 8th, which is the octave that takes you from C to C, for example, right?
yep.
So it's the same thing that it's just the musical version of what I just said with a castle, because you start on a lower A, you go through all the notes, then you end up on a higher A, but it's the same A.
Yeah.
It's just an octave up. You can go all the way up and down. Even how many octaves are there on a piano? There's a bunch, but you can hit the same note all over that keyboard. And what I'm saying is that I think that Revelation is doing the same thing. It's hitting the same notes on a keyboard, but they're higher frequency.
Yeah. Well, interesting. And I'm not trying to be a Kabbalist or a gematria kind of guy, but there's 7 notes in a scale, which is fascinating. And then there's we have 12 notes total, which is another interesting number. That's 12. Anyway. So that's just a little side. That's definitely a rabbit, but I think that's kind of cool too. But yeah. I totally. I think in a picture like that, I totally see what you're saying. It's a scale, so to speak. Goes up, goes down.
Well, how about this? Okay, Revelation 19 and Revelation 20 both seem to reference the Gog and Magog war from Ezekiel. What is it, 38 and 39, I believe. Yet a lot of people would have you believe that that's 2 different events. So
separated
that kind of killed my pre-mill view. Yeah.
Yep.
So, yeah. Is that kind of the same thing?
That's exactly the same thing. It's a great specific analogy. I think I did some work on that on my sermon on either one of those chapters. I don't remember which one, but probably the second one. you start to realize that, oh my goodness, he's drawing this imagery from the exact same passage in both of these wars. So how can it possibly be two different wars separated by 1,000 years? Doesn't make a lot of sense. Especially when in Ezekiel, it's just one war.
Yep.
But that's just how you write literature. And that's how they wrote this specific kind of literature. And that's how the ancient mind used to think. And so getting into their context out of our own can be helpful in at least letting people, what would be the right way to put this? At least letting them think about, maybe there's another way to read this book than what I've always considered. I don't care if people come to a different conclusion than I do on Revelation. I mean, all these views have been orthodox. Dispensationalism, maybe not because it's so new, but certainly premillennialism is maybe the oldest view that we have in the church. Although I think I might argue with that. But
hey, I think all millennials pretty old, Doug. I mean, I really do.
It is, and I think so too. And I don't think that Augustine originated it, like you hear so many people say. I think it goes back.
Justin Martyr, I think, in the dialogue with Trypho, says his premillennial view, that there are people who disagree with his premillennial view that he thinks are godly people. So
exactly. So all I'm doing is to help people see that there's more than one way to read the book, and I think we all just want to find out what the book actually means. Right. And I will say again that I don't know how explicit I was earlier, but I think we all kind of actually can end up in very similar places. And so just how we get there might be a little different.
Yeah.
You guys want me to take you into the John stuff?
Yes.
Yeah. And then don't forget, we want to hit the giant stuff, the Nephilim stuff, and how it might tie into all this too. So I don't want to keep you all day, right, Doug, but yep.
This is fun. I'll talk as long as you guys want to talk. You want to go for 2 hours? I don't care.
I don't think we've had a 2 hour, but people listen to them, man. I listen to the blurry guys, and when their stuff is hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes, I listen to the whole thing.
Let's just go as long as we need to go, because I don't want to shortchange this. So
yeah, cool.
All right, John. So here's the thing with John, and this is, I'll just kind of maybe I'll set it up in terms of give you the ending of it, and then we'll see how I get there. In my opinion, the Gospel of John is the earthly counterpart to Revelation, which is the heavenly side of it. And they're both telling the exact same history. And they're doing it from the perspective of three and a half sort of thing. So this kind of is related to the whole tribulation question, but in a very symbolic, different way of thinking about history. And this can kind of get complicated because you have to go back to Daniel and his weeks, and how there's 1 week left at the end, and how halfway through this week there's a sacrifice of atonement that's made, and all this kind of stuff. And the honest fact is, when you start looking at Daniel 9 and that prophecy, nobody is able to make sense of it perfectly. No view is. Yeah. And so the way that I look at it is that you have the first 3.5 years of that last week make a lot of sense to me, because that is Jesus's ministry on this earth that culminates in his death and resurrection. But then you have this last 3.5 time frame it can't possibly be a literal historical timeline, because that would have ended in sometime in the 30s AD, and nobody thinks that that's the case. So what you end up having is to kind of have a physical, literal, historical first 3.5 years, and then a spiritual, symbolic 3.5 years that complements it. So that the first, again, is the head, which is Christ, the person of Christ in his ministry. And then the second 3.5 is his body, his mystical body on the earth. And that 3.5 takes you all the way between the first coming and the second coming. That's how I look at it. And why would I do that? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is because of how I understand John and Revelation to be paralleling each other. And the first time I came across this, my jaw was on the floor. So essentially, John has edited these two books so that chapter 1 of John parallels chapter 1 of Revelation. Chapter 2 of John parallels chapter 2 of Revelation. And that goes all the way through chapter by chapter to the end. So that chapter 21 parallels chapter 22 of Revelation.
Wow.
It's even weirder than that. And so it's very specific and detailed. So here's just two examples. John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word. The very last couple of verses of Revelation. I am the beginning and the end. Here's the last verse of John. If they were written, the world could not contain the books. And here's almost the first verse of Revelation. What you see, write in a book. So what I've just done there is I've showed you that the very first and last of Revelation matchup and the very last of John and first of Revelation matchup. So this goes all the way through both books. Okay,
so is it like a big chiasm? Is that what it is?
It's basically a chiasm and an inverse chiasm together at the same time. So yeah.
Wow.
Sorry, I didn't tell you the second part. I read the verses without telling you. So not only does chapter 1 match up with chapter 1, but the last chapter of John matches up with the first chapter of Revelation. The next to last chapter of John matches up with the second chapter of Revelation. All the way to the first chapter of John matches the last chapter of Revelation.
That's amazing. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it's really
if the Holy Spirit's not involved in that, man. I mean, that's mind blowing. Wow,
it's completely mind blowing. And so I have a sermon. It's the very first sermon I did on Revelation. It's on our church's website under the Revelation tab. That people can go and see a whole bunch of charts for this if they want to visualize all the things I'm talking about. I'm just looking at it as I'm talking to you guys. And that's just some of the stuff that's going on. Revelation is also kind of an undoing of history, where you've got Revelation 1 matching up with something in 1 Kings, Revelation 4 and 5 matching up with an earlier book in Samuel, Revelation 9 matching up with now Joshua, Revelation 15 going to Exodus, Revelation 20 going to Genesis 7, Revelation 21 going to Genesis 2, Revelation 22 going to Genesis 1. So it's an undoing of history, bringing us back to the garden. There's all kinds of crazy things going on in this book. But to go back to John, let's see if I can find this here. The very center of John matches up with the very center of Revelation. So remember how I said that the center of Revelation is essentially Satan, who deceives the whole world, was cast to the earth and his angels. And I heard a loud voice in heaven, now has come salvation, and there were thunderings. Well, listen to the very center of John, because John is also chiastic. I didn't get into that, but it's the same thing. Here's the center of John. Then a voice came from heaven. The people heard, said it thundered. Others said an angel spoke. And Jesus says, now the ruler of this world, Satan, will be cast out. Exact same thing. But one is talking about it from the ministry of Jesus' point of view. The other is talking about it from the perspective still of that, but in the context of the church now having, its birth, its origin through the woman, and then right after that having to be thrown into the wilderness to be attacked by Satan.
Already, but not yet.
Already, but not yet. Yeah. So that kind of takes you naturally to the millennial question. This is a big question people have. And I'm sure a lot of people have never heard the John stuff. And it's, like I said, it's mind blowing. But if you have the center of John and the center of Revelation talking about the exact same thing of the world, ruler of the world being cast out, and they're paralleling each other, beginning chapters to beginning and then into beginning inversely, you have to take that into consideration when you're trying to interpret this thing. You have to. Okay. Now, if that's not enough, then we need to go to the millennial question. And what you end up having is essentially this center of Revelation, this casting out of Satan, is now repeated in the beginning of Revelation 20. So that the devil is bound by someone who comes down. He's thrown into this abyss, and he's specifically bound for a specific reason. It's the exact same thing. In fact, a whole bunch of the same exact words are used in both places. In other words, what I'm saying is Revelation 20 is talking about the very same thing that the center of Revelation and the center of John are talking about. And in John, he says it happened right now. It's not something that's going to happen in some future millennium sometime. And the way that I interpret that is that means that the millennium has started already. Because in Revelation 20, where it's adding new material, it's calling it the millennium. And for various reasons, I think that the millennium is described sometimes as a millennium. Sometimes it's described as 3.5 years. It's just different numbers are used to convey different ideas of it.
Right.
Okay. So, and is it literally a literal 1,000 years? Well, obviously, if my view's right, then it can't be because we're 1,000 years past that already. Right. So I take it as a symbolic number. And what else would 1000 be? It's not 1002. It's not 1,395 years. It's 1,000 years. That's a symbolic number, which the whole rest of the book is filled with. So if that's true, then you have to start asking the question, how is it even possible for Satan to be bound and the millennium be now? Because the way most people read the idea of the binding of Satan is that he's completely eliminated from doing anything in this universe for 1,000 years. Right?
Right.
Perfect heavenly bliss on earth. Nobody dies. There's no sin. Satan's locked up. Everybody believes in God. On and on and on. That's how they interpret the millennium to be. But I don't think that we have any reason to believe that that's how the millennium is going to be at all, unless you misinterpret passages that are talking about the end of the age and the eternal state with the millennium. But in my mind, that's a misinterpretation.
Yeah, that's what I've been seeing all these years is the millennium sounded like the end of the age to me, like the resurrection, Jesus is on his throne and we're done.
Exactly.
And I never understood why there had to be another 1,000 years of this and then a re-release of Satan. It just didn't compute with me. So this makes more sense. I have to admit, a lot more sense.
So let's look at some of the interesting words and choices of ideas that are found there in Revelation 21-3. You have an angel coming down who's going to do this binding. So, I wrote a whole book on the angel of the Lord, and I suggest that the angel of the Lord is Christ, pre-incarnate. However, he appears in an angelic kind of form sometimes in the New Testament, for example, at the Transfiguration. His face shone. He is the closest example we have of what happens at that point is it's like the glory, the veil's lifted, the glory is shown, and he's there like the angel of the Lord right in front of them. Revelation's doing the same thing, in my opinion, and it does it in this particular instance by saying he came down from heaven. Well, if John and Revelation are parallel books, who is it that comes down from heaven in the book of John? In fact, he says no one has ascended into heaven except the one who came down from heaven. It's himself. So Christ is the one who's coming down in that verse. What's he coming down to do? Well, he's coming down to bind the devil. So what does that mean? Does it mean that he throws iron chains on a being that isn't even physical? What does that mean? Well, binding was language that's used in the Old Testament. It's used throughout the intertestamental language for spiritual creatures, but also for, which in their mind would have kind of been overlapping, things like stars, constellations, So you can bind the Pleiades and the Orion in the book of Job. You can bind the Watchers in the book of Enoch. And what are you doing? You can bind the sea in the book of Jeremiah. Why would you bind the sea so that it can't exist anymore, so that it's nowhere near us? No, you bind the sea so that it won't transgress its boundaries, so that it won't become chaotic and flood the whole world again. You bind the Pleiades so that they are forced into their courses, so that they never move, so that they can be perfect time clocks in the heavenlies.
Oh wow!
And that kind of idea. So what is the binding then? Well, in my opinion, it's a legal covenant. Satan is forced now legally because of something that Jesus has done, namely conquered him at death and resurrection, from doing something very specific. I'll get to what he's bound from here in a moment. I want you to think about a couple other things. He's thrown into the abyss. The abyss. Well, a lot of people read that and with no other background, they go, oh, okay, well, that just means he's thrown into a dark, dark prison. He can never get out. Well, what's interesting is the abyss is actually where Leviathan, that we brought up earlier, is said to live. That's his home. But in John himself, even in this very chapter, he likens Satan to the dragon, who is the Leviathan. So what does that mean? Well, I think that what it means is that he's confined him to his home and he's put him under house arrest. When someone's under house arrest, they're not carted off to some penitentiary on an island somewhere. They're just confined to their house and they have to stay there. They're not allowed to leave that place. But they can run their whole kingdom from it. That's what Martha Stewart did when she was placed under house arrest.
Yeah, that's exactly what I thought about when he said.
It's what Al Capone did when he was put under house arrest.
Yep.
They still ran their whole kingdom. It doesn't mean that he's not capable of doing anything. He's just forced to be in his home. And what's he forced to do? Well, Revelation is very specific. It doesn't say that Satan is now bound from doing all things. He's no longer able to tempt. He's no longer able to have any interaction with humanity. No, it's very specific. He says he can no longer deceive the nations. Period. That's it. So if I'm right, then that means that when Peter says that the devil prowls around like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour, that can happen simultaneous to him being bound. Because God didn't put any restrictions in that sense on him. What he put restrictions on was a legal binding so that he can no longer deceive the nations. Now, has that happened? And the answer to that is yes. And if any, I'm sure that many of the listeners, and you guys certainly know about the divine council worldview, right?
Right. Yes. Yep. Totally.
This is very important. And anybody who knows this worldview can actually, this will actually make a lot of sense to them when they think about this. So the whole point of that worldview is that at the Tower of Babel, God gave the nations over to the gods, and the gods were now going to rule over the nations. And what Paul says to the Athenians in Acts 17, and this is based on things like Psalm 82, where they ruled unjustly and they did perverted things and they did not lead the nations to the proper worship of Yahweh like they were supposed to. They took that worship for themselves. They fell into great sin. And what Paul says then to the Athenians is that, look, God is very near to all of you, but you've been groping around in darkness, hoping you might feel your way to him. Why? Because the gods have deceived the nations. And the nations were not then led to him, and they were in darkness. This was going on all the way even before the days of Abraham, apparently, because God had to call Abraham specifically, well, Abram at that time, right? Specifically out of Babylon, I believe actually from worshiping the moon god. I think his whole family was a high priestly family in the moon god worship. That's a different subject.
Yeah,
But
I can see that.
but and that actually relates to the whole Allah and Islam thing, by the way, too, which is pretty interesting. But the point is that he was in darkness himself, and it wasn't until God actually called him, especially by name, and said, "I'm going to take you to the land, and I'm going to make a nation out of you, and nothing's going to stop this. You will now be a light to the nations." And Israel would be this light that would draw people up this hill, up this mountain, so that they could all come to know the Lord. Well, of course, that didn't happen, but it was still there. And what ends up happening is that Jesus ends up becoming that light and that mountain that draws the people upwards that Isaiah 2 talks about. And then he gives that power to his church, his body on earth. And so the whole book of Acts then is the reversal of the darkness, and the nations now are coming to Christ, following him, learning who the true God is, having faith in him. And what they're doing is Satan is no longer deceiving the nations. That's what the whole book of Acts is about. And when you understand that he was deceiving the nations until that moment, and now he no longer is, all of a sudden the binding of Revelation 20 makes a lot of sense, because you can go, yeah, I can see that. He actually isn't deceiving the nations as he was before. Now, some people will say, yeah, but a lot of people aren't saved. Of course they're not saved. It doesn't mean he's not deceiving individuals. What it means is that if God wants to bring a Gentile out of darkness in China or Kenya or Sweden or America, he can do that, and they don't have to become Jews. They don't have to get circumcised. They don't have to live under Mosaic law. That's all been taken care of. And that's exactly what we've been seeing for 2,000 years. Satan literally is bound from stopping God's plans with the church. He can't do it. And that's proof to me that we're in the millennium, because that's literally what the millennium is about. Here's a verse from the Gospel of Nicodemus. This just shows you some early thinking on this. It says, "Then the King of Glory seized the chief ruler Satan by the head and handed him over to the angels, saying, 'Bind with iron fetters his hand and his feet and his neck and his mouth.' And he gave him to Hades and said, 'Take and hold him fast until my second coming.'" So somebody a long time ago had this very same idea.
I'm just still overwhelmed. This is wow. Brain tilt. This is incredible. I mean, Revelation makes more sense to me. I mean, I've read it, bunches of times, and it's hard to flee from the whole dispensational. Even when you don't really believe it anymore, you still find yourself like wanting to do it linear and in categories and stuff. But this is amazing. This is amazing. Yep.
I know that I've thrown a ton at you guys, but it kind of is necessary, because if I'm going to present the view, I've got to find some way to make sense of it. So
Yep. Yeah, it's a fire hose, but it's a very welcome fire hose.
And to me, this doesn't really, what I'm presenting helps me make sense of what's happened the last 2,000 years.
Right.
It helps me make sense of how the devil can still be at play, and yet the millennium is still, we're still in it. And it helps me make sense of, at least to some degree, what's taking place right now. And what's taking place right now causes me then, at the same time, because of what we started with when we talked about, are we living in unprecedented times? And I think we are. And it causes me to go, this is not, the binding of Satan is not the end of the story. And too many amillennialists, in my opinion, act like it is. Like, okay, we can never get out of, the millennium will never be over. So why think about what's coming in the future? But the fact is, all of us, all the millennial views have in them a time when Satan will be let loose, and he will be incredibly angry and go against the church, and then Jesus will take care of him. Whether you say that that's after the millennium, like I do, or you say that it's before the millennium, like a premillennialist does, we all kind of have the same thing. And I think even postmillennialism has that, at least as a possibility in some cases for it to take place. So, in other words, we all have something horrible happening at the end. None of us know when it's going to happen. None of us know exactly what it's going to look like. But it is there in all of our views, because we're all still reading Revelation at the end of the day, and we know that things happen starting in verse 7 of chapter 20, and then we know that some point in time Satan is going to be thrown into the lake of fire, which is a very different idea than being thrown into the abyss.
Yes, very different.
So even though it might challenge some people to kind of think the way that I've thought here, don't take that to mean that I think that, I'm not even willing to entertain futurist sort of thoughts. I am willing to entertain them, but I'm not willing to be dogmatic about them.
Yes. Yeah, I don't think this is a topic to be dogmatic about at all. And I think what you said earlier, which I agree with, harkens back to the early fathers, is, there are multiple orthodox views. And I just don't want to see, some people act like if you don't believe in the rapture that you're a heretic. And that's not historical Christian teaching. So what about giants and Nephilim? How do they fit into some of this stuff?
So if they fit into it at all,
yeah.
If they fit into it at all, I do not think. So a lot of people are throwing out this Daniel reference, where like the seed of, I forget how it goes. The seed of somebody is mingled with the seed of men, or something like that, and they go, "Oh, this is Nephilim," and then the way they read that particular prophecy, it has to be talking about our future. Well, I don't think that verse is talking about the Nephilim at all. Like, angels aren't even in that to be mingling with the seed of men. People are totally making that up. It's not in the text as far as I've been able to see. Maybe it's some version of Daniel that I'm not aware of, but I don't see any angels there. So that one is not one that I am fond of saying could bring back the Nephilim. But I think that when Jesus talks about how the days of Noah, the days of his coming will be like the days of Noah.
Right.
We actually could go on a little sub point of this. This is Matthew 24, and I could give you kind of my reading of this. So this is the Olivet Discourse, where many people on the popular level take this to be the entire thing is about the future. And Brandon, you were talking about partial preterism, and I am a partial preterist, and actually read this particular sermon kind of simplistically, as essentially the first half of it is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, and the second half of it is talking about his second coming.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about earlier, Doug, when I was saying how I think we read some things, Jesus is going one direction and he's going another direction. I mean, we can change gears in conversation, but we tend to lump them all together.
We do. So if we read this carefully, this is what it says. Jesus left the temple, and as he was going away, when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple, he answered them and said, "You see all these, don't you? Truly I say to you, there will not be here left one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." All right, so that's what he says. This is prediction. Then it says, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, so they're in Jerusalem, they're looking at the temple. He's just predicted the whole thing's going to be obliterated. Now they cross over the Kidron Valley. They go up the Mount of Olives. Now they're looking back over at it. And the disciples privately say to him, "Hey, tell us when these things will be and what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age." So the way almost everybody reads that is it's the same question. When will these things be, will take place at the coming at the end of the age? But I believe Jesus sees these as two different questions. When will these things be? Okay, I'll tell you when they will be. And then he predicts all the things that will lead up to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. All you have to do is read Josephus to know that Jesus got it exactly right.
Right, yeah. Yep.
Exactly right. So the first, 20, 25, 30 verses, whatever it is of that, essentially is talking about the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. However, Jesus takes the second part, what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age? And then he shifts subjects and he tells them what it will be like. And at that point in time, we now move to the future. And that is the section where we find the whole days of Noah thing taking place. No one knows the day or the hour. So back in verse 36, now he's changed the subject because look, it says, but concerning that day and hour, what day and hour? The day and hour that the temple will be destroyed? No, he just told you exactly when that was going to be. He told you exactly what to look for, and all the Christians fled Jerusalem when it happened so that they weren't killed.
Right.
He knew exactly when that was going to be. But of this day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven nor the Son, but the Father only. Then he says, as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark. They were unaware of the flood until it came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. So my thought has been, as an amillennialist who knows that he had dispensational, bringings up and wonders, am I still going there? And I don't know if I am or not. But all I know is that the story about marrying and giving in marriage is the Nephilim story. That's what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And why would you say that? Like, why would you bring that up if it wasn't going to be the same way again? So to me, I think that verse certainly allows for the possibility that Nephilim will be back. I also think that you could maybe get the whole idea of the Watchers sort of doing the same thing again from the unleashing of Satan. Like, what does that mean? And especially if the other angels were locked up in Tartarus, according to Enoch and really Peter, and if they're let loose, maybe they could do something like that again. I don't know the answer to that. If it happens, I'm going to try not to be surprised if it happens in my lifetime. If it doesn't happen, I'm not going to be too worried about it.
So Doug, how do you interpret verse 31 for that first half? Look, yeah, it's hard to get past that. This generation will not certainly pass away until these things have happened. I've never been satisfied with the more futurist explanations of the word this generation. They just all.
Yes.
But 31's difficult too, and he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heavens to the other.
Yeah, so I know that there are preterist readings of this that guys like Gentry have dealt with, and I think that they deal with it pretty well. I don't know that I agree with them. I think that this is one of the verses. I don't remember that R.T. France in his commentary on Matthew that came out, I don't know, 15 years ago or something like that, before he died. It's just magisterial commentary. And he takes the view that I'm kind of giving of this Olivet Discourse, which is kind of an already not yet thing. A guy like Gentry, a true preterist in the 70 AD sense, he does not think any of this is dealing with the future. I do. And I think that this might be one of those verses that's in the earlier parts that France goes, yeah, that's probably talking about the second coming. But I can't remember exactly off the top of my head. But I do know when I said that the first half is the 70 AD, the second half is the second coming, I said that's generally speaking because of the very question that you just asked.
Yeah.
Well, let me interject something too, and I don't know if this is just something when you were sitting there talking about that, Doug. I was thinking about the fact that okay, you have one part of this is dealing with the Jews, and basically in AD 70, the Jews were they weren't wiped out, obviously, but their religion was.
Yeah,
Even to
completely.
this day, even to this day, there's no temple, so they're not complete in their worship. However, I find it interesting that when he switches gears, he doesn't talk about a Jew. He talks about a Gentile. I mean, I don't know if I'm wrong here, but Noah is a Gentile, correct?
No, that's not correct. Those categories didn't exist. So that's
Okay.
anachronistic to bring that back
Okay.
to Noah.
Okay. Okay. All right. But I was just I saw this parallel of maybe that he was referring to the inclusions or the preaching of the gospel to the Gentiles or the other people outside the Jewish faith. But yeah, you're right. It is anachronistic. So yeah, that way wouldn't work. I'm just speculating here. but I just wondered if that was because then it goes on and talks about this will not happen in this generation, and he might be talk. I thought he might maybe talking about the Jews, and then there's another generation of people outside the Jewish faith that the other could happen to. I don't know. Maybe I'm butchering the text. I don't want to do that. So
The whole Jew Gentile question is totally wrapped up in what we're talking about. And it's a really tough one. See if I can find this note here. Okay, so here's the thing. Like if you go to the beginning of Romans 9, Paul talks about how he wishes that the people of his own race, his biological Jewish brothers, would be
yeah,
saved and not be hardened, right?
right.
So he has this category for physical Jews. Earlier in the book, at the end of chapter 2, he essentially calls anybody who has faith in Christ a Jew. He makes this wordplay on
Spiritual Jew. Yeah,
Judah.
yeah,
May his
yeah.
praise is from God, his Judahness. And so a true Jew in that book is a believer in Christ. And the reason why is because he is true Israel. He is everything Israel was supposed to be and failed at. And so now true Jewishness comes through him. So the hard thing with this is that you have true Jewishness, but you never actually lose biological Jewishness any more than me as a Dutch, guy with a Dutch last name loses that Dutch heritage. I will always have that. But I'm an American, I'm a Christian. And so there's these different aspects of what's going on there.
Mm,
And
mm.
so the question of what does it mean, at the end of chapter 11, when Paul then talks about how, and all Israel will be saved, what is that talking about? Is he talking about the church? Is he talking about biological Jews? Well, even people in my own millennial circles totally disagree on this question. They don't know the answer to it.
Yeah.
Um, you can go to other places that make this kind of thorny. In fact, even in Revelation, you have Jerusalem being mentioned in two totally different ways. You have Babylon, Sodom, Egypt, Rome, and Jerusalem, all in a couple of chapters of each other, all spoken about the same way as the evil city. And I said Jerusalem is one of those. Babylon, Sodom, Egypt, Rome, and Jerusalem, all talked about very much as evil city. But then you have this kind of new Jerusalem coming out of heaven, and you have the camp of the saints in the end of Revelation 20. What's that talking about? Talking about Jews? Is it talking about believers? I have my own opinions on it, but people disagree on that question.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah,
So
that's baffled me too. Yeah.
I tend to think that in Revelation, and this kind of gets to some temple stuff too. A lot of people are looking for a rebuilt temple, a
Right.
third temple, a physical temple, and that's mostly premillennials that are looking for that. Will there be one? As an amillennialist, I'm like, I don't really care if there is or not. There might be. I don't know. But what I do know for 100% certain is that Jesus says that his church is the temple.
Yep.
And he says that he is the temple.
Yes.
That's unequivocal. And people just kind of skip right past that. And it's not spiritualizing. Like I said earlier, the spiritual reality is reality and it is literal. He is the temple and his church is the temple. And those who believe in him are the temple. So why in the world do we need another temple being built that is a type and a shadow of the reality that's already here. Well,
yeah.
I have my own opinion on that. Will there be another temple in the future that's built? Will it be torn down? I have absolutely no idea. I don't personally think that has anything to do with prophecy, but I could be wrong about that. I don't know. Because there still is this physical aspect of Israel that never goes away in the Bible.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and two, the New Jerusalem, in my understanding, in the book of Revelation, is going to take the place of the temple. We're going to be the temple in the New Jerusalem, like you said, and there's always going to be light, and that the imagery there is that we are the actual temple, not a building, just like we are the actual New Jerusalem.
When you read this is where the chiasm is very interesting and helpful. I can't remember the specifics right now, but when you read that part of Revelation, guess what your opposite is in Revelation? So when you're in chapter 21, where it's talking about the New Jerusalem, your counterpart in Revelation is the 7 churches.
Interesting.
And so a lot of the same words then reappear in the last 2 chapters that are found in those chapters on the churches in Revelation. And the conclusion then is, I think it's a double conclusion. One is that this New Jerusalem is already here. It has already come down out of heaven. The other one, though, is that there is a future reality to it that is even better than is what is already here. That's the amazing part about reading the book when you read it like this, because it's not like the second half of the book is identical to the first half. It adds stuff to it, but it also overlaps it. And so again, you kind of have the already not yet. So I don't read Revelation 21 as fully future, but I also don't read it as fully past.
Yep, that makes sense. Wow.
And again, that kind of goes back to the new age, the 2 age overlap that I talked about at the very beginning, where the age to come and the present evil age, they're here simultaneous.
Yeah.
Well, I don't ever want to put too fine a point on it, but I think you firmed my millennialism back up a little bit there. Sometimes I just want to be lazy and say, whatever, Revelation 20 sounds, it's just easier to say that's literal, but it creates so much more problems to me, that people don't want to deal with.
Yeah.
I've seen it. It's been interesting the last 3 years with 2 things going on at the same time. And hopefully you guys won't get kicked off and not be allowed to post this because of what I'm going to say here. But the 2 things are that you have this weird dualistic thing happening at the same time the last 3 years. You have this horrible attack on humanity in the form of this virus and vaccine and all the things associated with the war that they're perpetrating in Ukraine, the whole thing. So that if you're reading this eschatologically, you can go, premillennialism all the way, baby, because things are getting worse. At the same time that this is happening, you have this weird phenomenon of the 17th letter of the alphabet, this Q thing, that a lot of those people hear this and they read this and it's almost like they read it and become post-millennial. Like, oh my goodness, look, if this is going to happen, then everything really is going to get better very quickly. And I just think that's really strange and interesting. And as I was going through Revelation here in the midst of all this and thinking about all the stuff I just mentioned, my mind kept going, oh man, maybe the premillennials have something. And then I would go, man, I don't know if the Q thing's right. Maybe the post-millennialists have something. And then I came across a quote from, I think, Vern Poythress, where he essentially says all the views have their own strengths and weaknesses, but amillennialism is the one view among them all that's able to kind of incorporate all the aspects that they have into its own system. So
that's interesting.
Yeah, it really was interesting to me because, as I've gotten away from the study over the course of the last couple of years, just naturally, and and let time distance itself from the crazy events of 2020, especially. Maybe it's more natural to just kind of revert to what I've already been in. But to me, the pre-mill and post-mill thing, it kind of seems to me it kind of has to be one or the other. But we've already talked about overlaps here with post-mill and pre-mill with George Ladd in the view that I hold. And so it kind of makes me feel like, yeah, well, maybe the mill thing is able to account for the totality of it, even though it still has its problems, in a way that the others don't. So I've still remained mill after all this stuff.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Some of the Dutch Reformed guys are very futuristic and still very mill.
Yes, yeah.
So I can't think of all their names right now, but
yeah. We've really only talked about the millennial question, right? But there's another totally different set of principles to read the book, which is, do you read the whole book as taking place in the future, so a futurist? Do you read it all as taking place as preterist? So in other words, Revelation all took place in 70 AD, and that's what Ken Gentry's new commentary is going to be about. There's another way of reading the book, which is that throughout history, the historicist view, the book unfolds progressively through history. And in fact, this is the question where Poitras says, of the futurist, preterist, historicists, all of these schools have merit, but the mill view is able to incorporate the best of all of them. And I think that's probably true.
Yeah, I agree. I'm starting to see that. Yeah, the mill include it's I guess in my Anglican world, I would say it's the Via Media. It's the best. It's the best of both worlds. That's Van Halen there. But anyway, so, but yeah, I mean, it does. It includes. You can. I don't want to say pick and choose because that's off. That's what. Yeah, that's just modern religion. But it does. There is the ability to be able to see the different, like the strengths and them being welcomed into that viewpoint. And I've never really done a deep study of amillennialism. That's what's so amazing about this is I've studied post-millennialism because that's what a lot of Anglicans tend to be, and then I was raised, dispensational, so I know both of those. But I thought amillennial was Augustine, and in the Anglican Church he's kicked on a lot. No, people don't. Poor Augustine, he gets a lot of trash talk, and which I don't think is deserving. So, but yeah, thank you for enlightening me. I mean, really,
yeah.
this is an amazing way to look at the end times, and a amazing way to look at the world now, because I can still be cautious and I don't like the word worry because we're not called to worry, but be cautious and prepared for different things. Because I told a friend the other day, even if we're not in the end of the end times, that doesn't mean we're not in the end of the United States. I mean,
Yeah,
empires
exactly. How many
rise and
nations have
fall.
fallen and Jesus hasn't returned?
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And that doesn't mean that I don't need to be prepared for persecution or prepared for what what will happen. I personally don't think a country would invade us. I mean, all China would have to do is just pull their debt and we're gone, I mean, anyway, they don't have to send a single soldier over here. Anyway, this is my political rant, but yeah, I mean, and that's the Western arrogance that, or American arrogance. And I love America. I'm a patriot, and all this stuff. But it's that arrogance that so goes America, so goes the end times, and millennial can correct that as well.
You can help it, yeah. I mean, it's isn't it interesting that, I mean, I don't know what you guys think about this, but I've given you kind of a view of Revelation and the end times that really doesn't look at modern political theory and the stuff that's happening. And at the same time, I may be more interested publicly in what's happening politically than anybody that I know.
Yeah, definitely.
And so people kind of just assume that, oh, well, you must either be thinking that it's the end times right now because things are getting worse, and they just tie all that stuff. Or they'll say, oh, well, you must believe that you must be post-mill, and because you sound like the Q guys, and you sound like you think there's hope in a war and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, no, to me, none of this. I'm not whether it is end time stuff or not. I just don't know the answer to it. And so therefore, I am going to look at what's happening around me on both sides of this war. And I'm going to try and be honest with the information that's been presented to me, the things that I think that are happening with it. And I'm going to look at it through the lenses of politics. I'm going to look at it through the lens of God's sovereignty. I'm going to look at it through the lenses of a whole bunch of different things. And I'm going to try and be wise as a serpent, innocent as a dove. I'm going to try and prepare myself for the worst and hope for the best, and think that I have reasons for thinking, hopefully, not necessarily in a pie in the sky, hopefully way. Well, God will just deal. I'll go to heaven when I die. That's true. I have hope in that, but I'm not running to my eschatology to inform me on either side of what I think is happening in this world. That's a separate thing. It matters. It's important. It's always there for me. Jesus is going to return someday. Satan will be released someday if he hasn't already. The nations are still being saved, as far as I can tell. People are still coming to know the Lord. So all that is kind of going on as normal. Things are getting weirder and weirder in the spiritual realm. I'm going to keep my eyes on that. My eschatology will inform me of that. There's some overlap with it, but I'm not using my eschatology to tell people what I think is happening in this world. That's just not what I do. And people are really surprised by that. They don't really know how to deal with it.
Well, it's just not a hill that you're going to die on. Justification by faith is a hill you'll die on, but
exactly.
But this is just not a hill, but it is important, and it'll help you. Yeah, you can, like I said, you can have a newspaper in one hand and a Bible in the other, but not be as worried about the newspaper. I mean, it's its own entire entity, so to speak. Because I think it would be tremendously foolish. A lot of people just kind of ignore the news and ignore what's going on in the world, and hope for pie in the sky. But then the others are the Hal Lindsey types that everything in the newspaper is something. So yeah, I'm amazed at how you've just laid this out before us, and how much I agree. Not that I expected to disagree with you at all, but it was just, I've never heard millennial, and this is a very interesting viewpoint of eschatology, in my opinion. Now, so well, Doug, let's wrap it up. I appreciate you so much for coming on our show.
Thanks, man.
And we'll have you back sometime for something else. And you have a book called Conspiracy Theories that I'm reading right now, and that'd be fun to take a deep dive.
Well, I'm glad you guys had me on and talk about this. This is not something, like you said, I don't get to talk about it a lot. I kind of did a little thing with the blurry creatures, but it was mostly focused on Satan. That one hasn't come out yet. This has been a deep dive into a subject that I really am. I'm really thankful to you guys for letting me talk about this, because I think it's important to help other people think through what's going on in the world today. And
yes.
And most of the podcasts in our realm is so focused on the supernatural stuff that sitting down to get a little bit more grounded in our theology can be very helpful to that whole world, I think.
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of the niche that we're trying to go after. Is I want to be able to talk about of theology just as much as cryptids or the Nephilim or any of that kind of stuff too, because they're to me, they're all intertwined. They're all God's world, and they're all supernatural.
Yep.
So anytime we deal with the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, we're entering a eternal life or a supernatural realm. So it doesn't have to be novelty supernatural, is what I like, call some of that. I mean, it's not novelty, but it can become novelty. So
it can become addicting and
yes,
obsessive.
Yes.
especially if you don't have the other grounding to be able to help you think through it, then it's kind of like that's all you have to hold on to. And at some point in time, that's going to fail you just like anything else will.
Absolutely. I mean, people have asked me, how do you keep a sane mind when you look at all the occult stuff and all that kind of stuff? I said, well, the first thing is I'm grounded in the Word. I mean, I'm not bragging, but I do Professor Horner's Bible study, and that's one of the best Bible study reading plans out there. You get such a grasp of the entire gambit of Scripture, reading that. And I'm trying to start some Bible study groups with people using that Bible study where you can see the Bible as a whole, and you're in the Old Testament instead of just picking our favorite New Testament books. And but yeah. Well, thank you, Doug. We appreciate it. Always a pleasure to have you on our show, and we'll see you soon.
All right, guys. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening and supporting us. And remember, stay naturally supernatural.